We take the Spring Authorization Server a step further in this video. We build on the code from the previous video. The link to this video can be found in the upper right corner. Today in the first step we are going to modify the authorization server settings to our liking. In the next step we are going to customize the UserInfoEndpoint, first with a custom ID token and then with the UserInfoMapper. We start with the authorization server settings, and this being we can adjust some of the Spring authorization server settings. Issuer, Authorization Endpoint, Token Endpoint, Token Introspection Endpoint, Token Revocation Endpoint, JWK Set Endpoint, OIDC User Info Endpoint, OIDC Client Registration Endpoint. You can customize all these settings to your liking. Here we use the default URLs. Now we can briefly test all endpoints in Postman. We start with the JWKS endpoint. This endpoint gives you the info about the keys used to sign the tokens. To use this endpoint you do not need authorization. The next endpoint is the AuthorizationServerSettings. This endpoint also does not need authorization. The third endpoint is the OIDC info endpoint. This endpoint also does not need authorization. These endpoints provide all the info from the Spring Authorization Server. The next endpoints are the Client Credentials Login Endpoint and the Authorization Code Endpoint. These endpoints are used to receive an access token, an ID token, and a refresh token. With the Client Credentials Login Endpoint, you can only request an access token. In the authorization branch, first choose the type OAuth 2.0. Grant type client credentials. Access token URL. Client ID. Client secret. Scopes. And client authentication. It is best to click on Clear Cookies to erase all previous login attempts. Then click Get New Access Token, and in the new window you will get a new access token and all the info of this token. The Authorization Code Endpoint is the next and more comprehensive and more secure authorization endpoint. It is an authorization endpoint that works in two steps. In the Authorization tab, we choose Type OAuth2 2.0. Grant type authorization code with PKCE. Callback URL. Auth URL. Access token URL. Client ID. Client secret. Code challenge method. Scopes. Client authentication. Again, best click on Clear Cookies. And then Get New Access Token. We get a new window with the second step of authorization. We get to see the login window of the Spring Authorization Server where we have to log in with the user and password. If the login succeeds, then we get the tokens. The access token, refresh token, and the ID token, with all the info. The next step is to request an access token with a refresh token. To do this, we make a POST request to the token endpoint. In the Authorization tab, we choose Type Basic Auth. The username is client and the password is secret. In the Perms tab we have Grant Type and Refresh Token. If we press Send we get a new access token, refresh token, and ID token. Then we have the UserInfoEndpoint. This is a GET request to the UserInfoEndpoint with the authorization type bearer token. And as a token the access token. Now we only get back the username. Then the introspection endpoint. A POST request to OAuth2 introspect. In the Authorization tab we have Basic Auth with client and secret. In the Perms tab token with the access token. The last endpoint is the revocation endpoint. A post request to OAuth2 revoke. Again, type basic auth with client and secret, and as perms token with the access token. The first step to customize the UserInfoEndpoint is to modify the ID token with the OAuth2 token customizer. We need an OIDC user info service with the following code. You can find this code using the link in the description of this video. Then in the security config class we modify the OAuth2 token customizer. Here we pass all the claims of the OIDC user info service to the ID token. We can start the project and test with Postman. An important point are the scopes: profile, address, phone, and email. If we now do a GET request to the UserInfoEndpoint, we get a lot more info. The last part for this video is the UserInfoMapper. Now all the info for the UserInfoEndpoint is taken from the access token and no longer from the ID token. This way you can customize all the info to your own needs. All we need to do now is create a private method UserInfoMapper and configure this method in the security filter chain. Now if we look at the UserInfoEndpoint, we see a very different response. This was it for today. As always, you can find all the code on GitHub. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video.